What's up guys, my name is Ace, and it's time to revisit the foregrips in Modern Warfare to find out which one helps the most with recoil. Now yes, this is something I covered way back when the game first launched, but who knows what changed behind the scenes with all of the stealth updates and everything that have been happening over the months, where Infinity Ward tweaks things without telling anybody about it, and now that Warzone is out, I keep getting asked by people, what is the best foregrip to be using? So today, I decided to revisit this topic and do it right. I've been seeing a lot of people post claims about which grip is better, and they only use one single recoil plot, and in many cases, they aren't really standing very far back from their target either, and that's not the best way to get results, because even though the recoil in this game is somewhat predictable, it has the same general predictable path every time, there is always a bit of random variance involved, and this is why we need multiple recoil plots. So what I did is I took the time to get this done right, and tested all of the foregrips that impact recoil on the most popular guns for Warzone. So the Grau, the M4, the MP5, and the M13. Now the reason I only covered these ones instead of like every gun in the game is this is a very tedious and time-consuming process if you do it right like I did, and therefore it would take potentially weeks to get all of this together with the graphics and the testing and everything done properly. So I did have to pick the more popular ones, so I hope you guys can understand that. And I guess let's just hop into it. We'll start it off with the Grau 5.56. Keep in mind, I'm running these without any attachments aside from these grip attachments. Of course, you can stack this with barrels that help with your recoil or muzzle attachments that help with your recoil, but this video is entirely focused on foregrips. So you can see the different recoil patterns here, and let's start working our way through it. When it comes to the Commando foregrip, this one helps with recoil stabilization, whereas all of these other foregrips help with recoil control. Now, the difference between these two is important to note. When the game first launched, I gave a very vague description of this that I wanted to clarify. Initially, I said that recoil stabilization helps with horizontal recoil, whereas recoil control helps with your vertical recoil. And while that's kind of true to an extent, the better way to word this is recoil stabilization helps with the side-to-side bounce or the deviation off of the recoil path. Whereas recoil control focuses mainly on decreasing the magnitude of the overall recoil. It actually shrinks the recoil path down a bit. So with guns that tend to have a lot of side-to-side bounce, you generally want to help in the recoil stabilization department, whereas guns that don't bounce side-to-side very much, this is where you tend to want to lean more towards recoil control. So getting back into the recoil plot here with the Grau, with the Commando foregrip, you can see that it kind of straightens up that recoil path a little bit, and it doesn't bounce around side to side as much. And this is really helpful because straight vertical recoil is super easy to compensate for, whereas side to side bounce is much more difficult to compensate for. But moving on to the next three grips, these ones all help with recoil control. You can see that the Merc appears to be the best out of all of these when it comes to reducing that overall magnitude of recoil, but just by a very small margin. The Operator and the Ranger are quite similar, although it does seem like the Ranger has a little bit less side-to-side bounce, so it almost seems like it helps a little bit with stabilization as well. But overall, there isn't a massive difference between the Merc, the Operator, and the Ranger. At this point, I would mainly focus on what you're looking for as far as the other pros and cons go with these different foregrips. And just a quick refresher on that, with the Commando foregrip, we also get improved aiming stability, which is how much your gun sways around while aiming down sight, and this comes at the cost of movement speed, whereas the Merc foregrip comes with improved hipfire accuracy, but it does hurt your aim down sight speed as well as your aim walking movement speed. Now these same cons carry over to the Ranger foregrip, but this one helps with aiming stability rather than hipfire accuracy. And this just leaves us with the Operator foregrip, and with this one, we only get recoil control, and the only downside is a reduction to our aim down sight speed. Now, moving on to the M4A1, which is another extremely popular gun, especially within Warzone, but also in multiplayer, as we all know. With this one, we do see a fairly similar trend. The Commando foregrip, especially on those initial shots, they're much more in line. It's much more of just like a straight line upwards at the beginning, which definitely helps a little bit, and therefore the Commando is an excellent choice. Then when it comes to those last three, again, they all help with recoil control, and this time it appears that they're pretty much exactly the same in the recoil control department. So again, you just have to look at the other pros and cons to make your decision. Now, moving on to the SMG category, we have the most popular SMG in the game, the MP5. And taking a look at this one, it's very interesting. The Commando foregrip actually seems to hurt your recoil control. Like it adds recoil to the gun when it comes to the overall magnitude. And honestly, it doesn't even seem to help a ton with that side-to-side bounce. I used to use Commando foregrip like all the time on the MP5 until I realized a while back that that was a mistake. Now I run the Merc foregrip because, as you can see here, the Merc foregrip does appear to be the best in the recoil control department out of all of these foregrips. And this is one of the reasons I believe the pros have actually implemented a gentleman's agreement, so they no longer use the Merc foregrip on the MP5 just because it's so powerful there. So if you are a competitive player and you are looking for the next best thing when it comes to this, I would say it's probably the Ranger foregrip looking at this. With the Operator foregrip, some of those initial shots seem to get a little bit out of hand, whereas the Ranger seems to help a lot more within those first 5 or 6 shots. That is at least according to these recoil plots. Again, there's always some element of randomness to this, but this is why I do 3 recoil plots so you can see more of a trend. For everybody else though, where they're playing where there's no bans or gentleman's agreement or anything to not use it, you definitely want to be using the Merc foregrip on the MP5. It helps a ton. Now, getting into my current favorite gun to use in Warzone, this is the M13, and taking a look at the recoil plots right here, lately, I've been using the Merc foregrip a lot for the M13, and just looking at the overall magnitude of recoil, it does seem like it is kind of the best, but by a very slight margin. However, at the end of the day, the M13 is already so accurate that it doesn't really matter all that much which one of these foregrips you're using, because none of them really significantly reduce that already great recoil. Now, that's not to say that it's completely useless to use one of these foregrips. It absolutely still could be helping you in some situations. Oftentimes, all it takes is being a couple pixels off target at longer ranges to screw you over. So I'm not necessarily going to be abandoning the foregrip on the M13, but it might not be quite as useful as you may have thought. But with that covers all of the foregrip testing with these top 4 most used guns within Warzone, at least based on what I've seen and what I've experienced. However, I did want to do a bit of a bonus here. I've been seeing a ton of claims lately that the VLK 3x optic also helps with recoil, and I wanted to put that to the test properly because I've kind of messed around with this a little bit in custom games, and I was just doing like single recoil plot tests side by side, and I was getting really inconsistent results. So let's do it right this time and have a look for all of these guns. With the Grau 5.56, the VLK doesn't seem to have any impact whatsoever on the overall magnitude of your recoil. It still kicks upwards the same amount. However, if you take a close look at it, it definitely seems to help with recoil stabilization. It doesn't bounce side to side nearly as much, which, like I said when I was talking about the Commando foregrip, this is excellent on guns that kick pretty much straight upwards because that's easy to control. And therefore, it does look like there's some validity to using this VLK 3x optic on the Grau 5.56 at least. But next up, I did want to have a look at the M4A1, and I was surprised to find pretty similar results, although with this, it also seems to help with the magnitude of the recoil, at least sometimes. It was a little inconsistent here. You can see the middle recoil plot still had roughly the same magnitude as the base recoil. But we do also see a similar trend as with the Grau, where this definitely appears to help with your recoil stabilization. That side-to-side bounce, or the deviation from the path, is noticeably reduced while using this optic. Now, moving on to the MP5, once again, it looks like it does help with that recoil stabilization a bit, but I did want to mention this isn't usually an optic that you would use with an SMG. It's more so designed for the mid to longer range fights, which is generally outside of where you want to be challenging people with an MP5. I just thought I'd throw it in here to be nice and thorough with my testing. But finally, this brings us to the M13, and just like with the Grau, it doesn't really seem to help with the magnitude of your recoil, but it definitely appears to help with that side-to-side bounce. And therefore, this isn't just a one-off sort of a fluke thing. This optic consistently helps with at least recoil stabilization on every gun that I've tested so far. And this is really interesting because there is no mention of this whatsoever in the stats. Now, if you look at the stat bar, it does say that it helps with your accuracy, but it says that with all of the optics, even though I know that's not true with the other optics. And on top of that, the stat bar says that optics increase your range, which they absolutely don't increase your actual damage range of your gun. So those stat bars are generally never to be trusted because they're often extremely misleading and just straight up inaccurate. But in the case of the VLK, it definitely helps. Now, does that mean that you should immediately put this on all of your guns? Not necessarily. It does come down to preference. I often don't like using sights that zoom in more than a reflex sight, for instance. It just feels a little bit awkward to me. But in some of my builds, like maybe on my Grau, for instance, I might start implementing the VLK 3x optic every once in a while at least. But with that, it's about time to wrap up this video. Personally, I tend to lean more towards the Commando foregrip on the guns that don't have like a big jump up in their recoil. So like the MP5, for instance, that has a big jump within the first couple shots. Whereas with the Grau or the M4, there isn't much of a jump. It's pretty consistent straight up recoil that has some side-to-side bounce in there, and therefore correcting that side-to-side bounce with the Commando foregrip is excellent. Then again, when it comes to guns that do have that big jump on the first shot recoil, like the MP5 or the AK-47 for instance, these would be best suited to something like a Merc foregrip, which generally does appear to be slightly better in the recoil department compared to the Operator and the Ranger foregrip, but those ones are like just behind the Merc foregrip on average, and you might like some of their other benefits more than the Merc foregrip. Additionally, I was quite surprised to find that the VLK 3x optic actually helps with recoil stabilization by a noticeable amount on average. And with that, I'd like to know in the comment section below, were you surprised by any of these results today? Is this going to cause you to switch up any of your classes? Just let me know those thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.